This is Women's Tech Radio,
a show on the Jupiter Broadcasting Network interviewing interesting women in technology, exploring their roles and how they're successful in technology careers.
All right, Paige, I want to talk about credibility barriers. And I know there's quite a few of them, but the one that I want to spotlight for me is it actually happened on Tech Talk today. Chris and I were talking about a Microsoft story, and it was like, an unbelievable one. Like, I was just like, oh my gosh, this is horrible. And, internet trolls, they go on the YouTube video and they start talking about how I was just taking the stance of my husband because, how could I possibly have an opinion about Microsoft that's my own? And it was so infuriating. And I know that trolls shouldn't really bother me, but it is an example of kind of why we do the show. Like we do technology too. We are allowed to have our opinions about products, and I'm a Mac, but I've worked on Windows, so it's not like I don't know it. So anyway, do you have one?
No, yeah, I totally understand. I mean, I've been, my story is very similar to a lot of our guests. I'm not traditionally trained as a computer developer, but I have a lot of experience. I work on Windows, Unix, Linux, Mac, whatever. But being in a lot of those situations where it's questioned like, well, you don't have formal schooling for this, you must not know.
Right.
Or like all that stuff. But I think for me, like the credibility barrier has been the biggest barrier for me has been internal. Like that, especially right now in my career where I'm really transitioning into like a team lead and real full developer roles and everything. And I'm sitting there saying to myself, oh, well, I don't have the degree. I didn't graduate from one of these fancy boot camps. I don't have any of that. And like, it's that imposter syndrome is really, like, that internal stuff is like, I'm used to it with the guys. I worked in a garage. I worked in construction. Like, I don't care. Like, you can think whatever you want about my credibility. It's what I think that matters. And right now, I'm getting it my own way. And I think that's almost the worst.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Totally understand.
Yeah. And I think our guest today would agree with some of that. Like, she definitely has got a lot of confidence in what she's doing and has a non-traditional path. And like, just hearing all of that from her is super inspiring for me. And I hope it is for the audience too. So today we were joined by Caryn. She is a UX designer at Stateless Networks, and she talks about becoming a UX designer and kind of that path for her and what it's like to work in a technical field as an awesome, creative, multi-talented individual.
Yep. And before we get into the interview, I want to mention that Women's Tech Radio will be at Linux Fest Northwest at the end of April. And
I'll be there.
Yes, we are currently running a t-shirt campaign to fund flying some people in, and also, for us to be there. And you can go to teespring.com/Linux because, it is Linux Fest Northwest after all. But it should be really interesting. Anytime we do these Linux Fests, we end up seeing so many of our shirts and so many supporters and fans. And we'd really like to see you there if you're local. A lot of our guests have been from Seattle. So I wouldn't be surprised if we got to see some of those people. But yeah. Go over to teespring.com/Linux and support our venture to Linux Fest Northwest this year.
And we got started with our interview today by asking Caryn to kind of tell us about her role right now.
What I'm doing right now is I'm working for a very small tech startup in Seattle called Stateless Networks. And we're working on some network administration tools, kind of trying to take network administration tools into use for the current generation.
So what does a day in that look like for you? So you're doing something for network design. Does that mean you're like drawing wire diagrams for how people plug Cat5 cables together? Or what kind of stuff is that?
Kind of. So we're working on, if anybody who's listening is familiar with any kind of network administration tool, they tend to look really super outdated, like from the Windows 3.1 era of graphic design. And or they're really text heavy. They require, terminal windows open and stuff like that. And so, what we're trying to do is we're trying to provide a more visual method of working with your network if you're a network administrator, or even if you're not a network administrator, if you're somebody who works at a company and you have to deal with the network at all, we want to make it more user-friendly. So Stateless Networks is about 8 people. There's about 6 of us in Seattle. And what we're trying to do is make it much easier for people who are network administrators, or sometimes not even network administrators, who have to work with a network being able to do that. So yeah, when you say that, like am I drawing wire diagrams of people plugging Cat5 cables in, that's kind of what we're doing. We're actually trying to show you a visual diagram of your network and letting you interact with that visual diagram in a way that has a nice user experience, and is much easier to use than the current batch of tools that are out there.
Very cool. Yeah, I've had some experience with that. I came out of sound design and theater, and that was something that we had a lot of tools for, was actually drawing like these digital wire diagrams for how to wire a theater together for sound. Nice. But when I moved over to computers, yeah, there weren't tools that made me do that. It was always a pain in the butt to actually try to put it together. It was very much, yeah, like you're saying, the terminal tools still. Web 90s is alive.
Exactly. So we're trying to kind of take the tools out of that era and bring them up into modern web standards.
So how do you do that as a UX designer? Like, is that something, are you in Photoshop all day long, or how are you, like, are you interacting directly with developers? What does that process look like?
So it's a little bit of everything, which is why the job is so fun. Usually what I'm doing is a good portion of my day is often spent in my sketchbook, because I like to lay a good solid foundation of sketching before I get into anything that involves Photoshop mockups. I sketch out ideas. I do storyboarding via Sketchwork to kind of take a use case, like, hey, I'm a network administrator and I want to search for this node to the path from this node to this node or something like that. And what I'm going to do is as the user experience designer, I'm going to sketch out all the ideas I've got for displaying that information in a good, clean way, and what kind of interactions are actually going to happen. Like, I need to decide, is this person going to be doing a query in a search box, or are they going to be looking around their network and tapping on things to find info? Both options might be viable. And so I start off with my sketchbook and I sketch as much as I can, thinking, just basically using sketching as a thinking process. And then I will take those sketches and usually coalesce them into something like a storyboard, where I've got some good ideas that have fallen out of that sketch process. And I put them together into a storyboard that demonstrates like what I'm thinking might be the flow and interaction for this particular thing that this use case I'm trying to demonstrate. And then once I've got that, I'll usually run those sketches by people if they're really rough and I'm not really sure if I'm correct in the direction I'm going in, because I'm not a network person. So I usually have to check with people in the office who are the network people, which are some of our engineers. And I'll usually run these sketches by them and say, hey, does this seem like the right path? If you were, working with a network, would you do this? And then they'll give me feedback on that, and I'll iterate on those sketches if I need to, or I might then go into Photoshop or Illustrator and start actually doing mock-ups or wireframes. And when I get to that stage, I am usually working heavily in Photoshop or in Illustrator or in Sketch sometimes. It really just depends on what it is I'm trying to do. I pick the tool that's most appropriate for what I'm doing. And I create some mock-ups that I can then string together into a really rudimentary prototype. And so I'll take, I have a tool that I really like called Envision. I don't have any affiliation with them. I just really like the tool. It's a really great, simple prototyping tool where you take screens that you've mocked up and string them together with hotspots to demonstrate flow and basic interactivity. So I'll do that in order to get a sense for whether or not tapping through these things or interacting with these things in a simple way actually makes sense. And then I'll usually hand that off to some people and say, hey, give this a try. I'll give them a basic task and say, hey, you're trying to search for something, or you want to get information about this particular thing that you're looking at on the network. Give that a try and tell me what you think. So it lets me get some feedback from people after that I've built a really simple prototype.
And so who's your customer? Because I used to work in IT consulting, and we'd have to diagram networks all the time. Are you going for small businesses like IT consulting agencies, or are you going to big companies?
We have a variety of customers we're looking at, which I think our CEO wants to keep secret.
Oh, okay, sure.
So I can't talk too much about that.
That's
but
fine.
Yeah, we have a variety of people from big and from mostly people who have large scale networks.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So especially with the fact that you're talking about starting on paper with sketching, I'm guessing that you may have some background that's non-technical. Like, how did you end up in such a highly technical field as designing a product for network administrators from someone who sounds like you have some sort of other background?
So it's really funny. I don't have a background at all related to design or anything. I actually started my adult life out as an astrophysicist, which has nothing to do with network administration or design.
Yeah, wow, that's out
Um,
of left field.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's completely out of left field. Yeah, I just had always been interested in design, and I had a variety of hobbies outside of what I was doing as an astrophysics student. I was doing astrophysics research and going on to get my PhD, and I actually got heavily involved in the video game industry. And I was doing some writing and some graphic design for them when I got offered a job to do to basically run websites for this company called GameSpy, and to run their biggest website, which was Planet Quake. For the game Quake back in the 90s, and which I played a lot of, and I was a huge addict. And so I at the same time as I got this job offer, it was really weird. The funding for our research ran out. There was a mass exodus of professors from the university I was at. It was as if the universe was saying, "You just need to go take this job for a while." So ended up working for GameSpy for a couple of years, and started out running Planet Quake, then became their action genre network producer. So I was working with developers and writers on providing content and updates for a lot of their game focused websites. So gradually that transitioned into a career where I worked directly in the game development industry for Activision as a publisher, and then Raven Software as an actual developer, where I transitioned from doing things like graphic design, which had been a hobby of mine, into user interface design, where I worked on Quake 4. That was the first game I did UI design for. And from there, it's been about 10 years since then. I had just until a few months ago when I joined Stateless, I had actually been a user interface and user experience designer for video games. So I had worked on like Quake 4 and a bunch of other titles, and then I gradually moved into mobile free-to-play games. I was just working at Z2 up until last year when I got contacted by Stateless. And so really my background is completely nowhere related to design and technical stuff. And doing network administration, you would think, oh, you should probably have a background in networking, right, before you do this. But in actuality, the CEO of our company actually was really interested in having people who came from the world of gaming to do what we're doing. I actually work with two other people I used to work with in the gaming industry at this company. And it's our gaming experience that makes us valuable to the company, because the way we're sort of approaching the user experience of interacting with your network is a lot like interacting with user interfaces in games and large scale multiplayer networks.
Yeah. I mean, I think in any line of work, the closer that we can get it to feel like play, the
Yep.
better off we are.
Definitely.
Exactly. That's part of our goal. Is the user experience should be enjoyable. It should be something that feels rewarding to do rather than tedious.
So that's a pretty crazy background story. Do you feel like there were points in there where you were really struggling because you have kind of a, especially compared to a lot of people who are in these fields, like a non-traditional thing? I guess gaming, like, and could you speak to this, because I only have friends who are in the gaming industry? Like, is there a typical path in the gaming industry, or did you actually feel at home because there's no typical path? Like, nobody goes to school and gets their PhD in gaming.
That's a really interesting question. There's a little bit of both. In some sense, you're absolutely correct. There has never been a traditional path in gaming, and so most everyone I worked with came to it from really out of the blue fields. But the thing is, as a user interface designer, there is almost an established way to get there, and I did not follow it. So in some sense, within my field, I was the outlier. My husband, for instance, was also a UI designer for a while. We actually worked at a couple of the same companies, and he does come from a traditional background of illustration and graphic design. He went to school for graphic design. Most people who get into UI design in games come from a graphic design background or some kind of web design background, and I didn't. I was self-taught. So I did have a lot of that self-consciousness about having done this as a hobby and learning and teaching myself along the way. And as a result, I kind of have my personality is the type that when I become drawn to something and I really want to learn it, I'll just dive into it and think, oh, I don't know nearly enough about this as I should. And so I'll really dive into it to try to make up for those deficiencies. And so I just kind of threw myself into learning everything I could about proper UI design and absorbing everything I could from the people around me that I admired who were doing it and who were doing good graphic design. And that's kind of how that was the way I learned.
what do you think was like the most valuable part of that process for you? Like, was it a certain type of school or books or mentors, or like what about it made the journey possible for you?
I think what made the journey possible for me was when I started actually branching, when I was in the game industry and I started looking outside of the game industry for inspiration. That was really the moment where my career as a user experience designer took off, because up until then, I was a UI designer, called pretty much a UI designer, and the game industry kind of has this. Everybody in the game industry has a different definition for what you do as a UI designer. Sometimes they'll call you a UI artist. Sometimes they'll call you a UI designer. And I was a hybrid of technical and art. I am actually mostly a technical person. I like to do scripting and programming whenever I can. And so my actual artistic level of my skill is kind of low. And so a lot of times I would get hired by companies who were looking for this sort of weird unicorn person who could do both technical stuff and art stuff. If you paired me up with a really good artist, then we made a really good UI team. And the problem with this is that there wasn't much for me. It was hard for me to learn from other people because I was often the only UI designer at the companies that I worked at. And for me, I really love being surrounded by people who are better than me at what I do because I really like learning from other people. And so I had such a hard time like finding myself in that position. And I realized that every time a company would talk to me about what I did and I described it to them, they'd say, so you're like a UI artist, but you also do programming and design? I'm like, kind of, yeah. And when I looked outside of the industry at the way, say, the web industry or people who make mobile apps do things, there was this field I'd never heard of before called user experience designer. And when I read about it, I was like, oh my God, that's what I do. Like, I didn't realize it. I'm not really a UI artist. I'm actually a UX designer. And when I did that, I realized that there were a host of techniques and all these different methodologies that people outside of games were using to improve their interfaces. And I thought, I'm going to do that because I didn't really have a formalized process. I just had sort of a hodgepodge process that I developed over time. And when I started researching what it is that user experience designers did outside of the game industry, I brought those techniques into what I was doing, and it just immeasurably improved I think the way that people were perceiving the interfaces I was working on, getting data, making them better. So that's where I think things really jumped for me.
That's great. Now, I was on your Twitter page, and it appears that you might have a knitting app.
Oh, I'm actually working. I don't have an app yet. It's a thing that I'm kind of working on. I don't have much free time right now. I have a 3-year-old and also another kid on the way in a month. So,
oh, wow.
So, in my prodigious spare time, I'm trying to kind of use this concept of a knitting app to almost to just kind of improve my UX design skills outside of what I do. Mm-hmm. As a knitter, I've been a longtime knitter for over 20 years. And I spin my own yarn as well. And it seems like a lot of the knitting apps that are out there, I've looked at them and I thought, they can be better. And so I thought, well, I'm a user experience designer. I should use my skills to try and make one and see, because I really do love to get into like actual app design and actually creating my own app. So it was a chance to try and do that. So I started basically using my own UX methodologies to try and build one. And I'm at the point where I need to actually prototype a paper prototype of it with a large knitting group. And so I need to go find one and take a prototype and have them test it.
Oh, very cool. Have you joined Meetup by chance?
I have, and I just haven't had a chance to. There's a lot of knitting groups on there, and I just haven't had a chance to like get myself together, get all the stuff I need together, and figure out what the best the test is, and then find the group that will let me come and spring it on them.
Right.
Are you going to continue to blog about the process?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a really good thing to blog about because it's a lot of people ask me like, well, what are these processes that you use? And so doing my blog articles about it is I think, a really great way to get that out there.
Yeah. So if the listeners want to check it out, it is on Caryn's website, and we'll have a link for that in the show notes.
Yep.
Yeah.
So Caryn, this has been fantastic. I think your journey is really interesting and really awesome to hear. It's great to talk to someone in gaming, and I'd love to have you back at some point to talk more in depth about some of that experience. But we're running long for today, and so just one final question. I'd just like to, two questions, rapid fire. So what tools are actually in your stack? Just kind of real quick. You've mentioned a whole bunch throughout the interview, but like, what do you use on a day-to-day basis?
On a day-to-day basis, I use my sketchpad, lots of markers and pens. I use InVision, envisionapp.com is the other tool, and Photoshop and Illustrator.
What gets you fired up about tech right now? What are you excited about that's either coming down the pipe or that's kind of keeping you up at night thinking about it?
VR. I got a chance to try out some virtual reality stuff recently, and it's really exciting, and I really want to try it out some more.
Thank you for listening to Women's Tech Radio. You can see the show notes over at jupiterbroadcasting.com, or you can email us, wtr@jupiterbroadcasting.com.
You can also find us on Twitter at HeyWTR. Check us out on Tumblr at heywtr.tumblr.com, and also find us on iTunes. And if you have a moment, help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes. We'd really appreciate it. It helps us reach more women and get the word out about how awesome we can have it in technology.